If you were to encourage a movement that would try and bring about a great change, a movement that would be countercultural, what would you say? What would you do? When we think about a world that needs to be countered from the violence that goes on and the horrific, awful, harsh speech that often is portrayed even on social media, when we think about the laziness that can accompany many people or the conflict that exists where everything is polarized today, what would you say? I don't know about you, but I know that I would want to write a detailed letter. I'd want to spell out things. I'd want to talk about all the ways that we need to counter the kinds of harshness and violence and anger and hatred that exist in the world. When Paul writes this little letter to Titus, it's a dense, full letter. It's a letter jam-packed, though it's only 3 chapters long. It is full of things that Paul writes to the people on the island of Crete, specifically to Titus, for him to read to the church and to communicate to the congregation there. And he does that because the Cretan way of life is one where they are liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons, as Epimenides had said. And the kind of life that they were living was full of turmoil and conflict and hatred. It was an island where many mercenary soldiers had lived, and so they were fierce warriors, highly independent. And Paul's letter to Titus really is not that different from what our culture is increasingly moving towards. That our world that we're living into is filled with all sorts of harsh speech. You just have to go on social media for a few minutes, even go onto Facebook, the Ilderton Neighbors Facebook page, and sometimes you can just see the rancor and cantankerousness that people can have about various things that really don't deserve much rancor or cantankerousness towards. We see everything in our world being politicized so that everything is either left or this is left or right. This is your left, by the way, and this is... Anyways, everything is polarized into left and right. And because of that, every single issue becomes a political issue. And if you don't think the way that I think, well, then you're somehow an opponent that I've got to suppress or that I've got to argue against. And in fact, today what we see is increasingly, because everything is either on the left or on the right, because of these polarizations, then what happens is just an anger and a hatred towards anyone who doesn't think like me. Or there's just, I just don't care. And there's ambivalence. There's not an ability to talk or to do good to one another. And in the midst of this, Paul's dense letter is a gospel letter about how we can think and do in light of the gospel, in light of the truth that Jesus Christ has come to rescue people like you and me. What does that look like? It's an encouragement, and really, the letter of Titus is a call to devotion. How can we be fully devoted? And in this letter, call to devotion, I want us to see 3 things this morning that Paul is calling us to be, in a sense, devoted to and because of. And the first thing I want us to see is that Paul is encouraging us to be devoted to one another. We see this in verses 12 and 13. Look at what Paul says. When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Do your best to speed Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. See that they lack nothing. We often think of the Apostle Paul in terms of being a highly independent man, a strong man of conviction, though small in stature and maybe weak-looking, a very independent man, roaming around through Roman countryside on the Roman roads, hitting strategic cities with his gospel message, and fiercely independent. Yet when we read the book of Acts and we go through Paul's letters, what we find is Paul's not a highly independent man. He's highly confident, not confident in himself, but confident in the gospel. But he's a man who has a strong circle of friends around him. He's a man who has people who are committed to the gospel, partnering with him, who are writing letters with him, who are supporting him, and whom he is supporting so that the gospel would go forward. And so we can think of people like Silas or Timothy or Titus. Here we have four names: Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos, who's also mentioned elsewhere. Tychicus, who's a name that is mentioned in Ephesians and Colossians and 2 Timothy. We hear of Artemis here. There's just countless numbers of people that seem to travel with Paul. Luke makes it very clear in the Acts of the Apostles that Paul actually has a strong contingency. He's got a network, and he's moving around the Roman Empire not as a solo figure, but as this apostolic or missionary team going and planting churches in different communities. And as they do this, Paul is constantly referring back or forwards to people that are partnering with him. So when we come here at the end of Titus, what we find are four names. Paul says, specifically, he says, when I send Artemis or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Now, what Paul here is probably saying is he's sending the letter that he's given to Titus. He's sending it with Artemis or Tychicus. Now, we don't know anything about Artemis. It's the only time his name really appears in the Bible, and so we don't know much about him. It's a Greek name. We do know a bit more about Tychicus. Tychicus was a loyal friend of the Apostle Paul. He had been sent to Ephesus to do work there. Paul calls him, in the book of Ephesians, he calls Tychicus his beloved or dear friend. So he's very near and dear to the Apostle Paul. In 2 Timothy 4, we're told that Tychicus was somebody who was with Paul at the end of his life, and Paul is again sending him back to Ephesus to be of support to Timothy. That's 2 Timothy 4:12. And so Tychicus, he was a man who was really devoted to encourage Paul, support Paul, work with Paul. In the same way, Paul says to Titus, I'm sending either Tychicus or Artemis. I don't know who I'm going to send, but I'm going to send one of them, and they're going to deliver this letter to you. And when they deliver the letter to you, what I want you to do is I want you to make sure that they're well received, and then I want you, Titus, to come and join me in Nicopolis. Nicopolis is probably 200 and some miles northeast of Athens, so it's quite a ways away. And when Paul is saying this, he says, I'm going to winter there. I'm going to spend the winter. So probably Paul is writing this letter like mid to late summer. And as he's writing in mid to late summer, he's preparing Titus to come and travel to meet him at Nicopolis because Paul wants to encourage Titus and be refreshed by Titus. It's a purposeful and intentional friendship. It's not just a bunch of buds hanging out and wanting to chum together. There's a very specific intention that Paul has. He's sending relief for Titus so that Titus can get away because it's been a high-pressure situation, setting the churches in order in the island of Crete and trying to deal with false teaching and trying to deal with all sorts of conflict and people who have been harsh and difficult. And Paul is trying to give Titus both the encouragement in this letter and the opportunity to come away to be refreshed. Now, Paul says that when he says in verse 13, do your best to speed Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. See that they lack nothing. Verse 13. We get the clear indication from Paul that well, we don't know much about Zenas. It's a Greek name. It's a Roman name. So probably he could be well trained in Greek or Roman law. We don't know. It might be Hebrew law. But regardless, he's a lawyer. He's well trained. And Paul says, make sure you speed him on his way. We don't know anything more about Zenas the lawyer. But we do know this name Apollos, and it probably is because it's he was such a well-known figure in the early church that it's probably the Apollos that Paul had worked with, the Apollos that had accompanied Paul and worked especially in the church of Corinth. And in Corinth there had become divisions over whether it should be we follow Paul or we follow Apollos, and Paul says, none of that. None of this division's based on whom we follow. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Here are two men now that Paul says, listen, Titus, speed them on their way. Make sure every need that they have is taken care of. And for good reason. For good reason, because in the first century world, there wasn't a Super 8 that you could stop in at. There wasn't a nice hotel like Holiday Inn where you can get your continental breakfast and then be on your way. There was none of that. In fact, there was just this highly dependent circle of friends and communities of faith who would support one another. And so as Zenas and Apollos are sent off, and as either Artemis or Tychicus are received, the expectation was that they would be so devoted to one another, the cause of Christ, the commitment to planting churches and seeing the gospel go forward, that they would care for one another. That they would bring them into their homes, that they would feed them, and that whatever need that they have, that they would be well cared and provided for. And Paul makes that clear. There is this sense of being devoted to one another. There's a like-mindedness. There's a sense of camaraderie. We're in this together. We have a common mission, and our common mission is gospel advancement. And so, Paul really is here communicating his deep love and affection for Titus and for these co-laborers in the gospel. It makes me ask this question: how are we devoted to one another? What does devotion to one another today look like? What does it mean for us to be so committed to one another, to our well-being, that if you suffer, I suffer, and if you rejoice, I rejoice? What does it look like for us to consider one another's needs, that we provide for one another, that we care for one another, that we know one another? But it's not just a call to care for one another, but it's also a call really to care and think about, if God has been so gracious to us as a church, if he's been so kind to us here at CBC Elderton, what does that look like for us when we think now that God has maybe uniquely positioned us, not because we're so great or because we've done anything so amazing, but because he has been so good and kind to us? And we're learning to grow in our love for one another, as Jesus commanded in John 13:34 and 35. By this you'll know that you are by this all men will know you're my disciples, by your love for one another. If this is how we're growing, then shouldn't we have a sense of, we don't want this blessing merely for the sake of our own church? Isn't it for the betterment that other churches do well, that we encourage other churches to be like-minded, to be strengthened, to be helped? Isn't it for the betterment of our entire region that churches partner together in like-mindedness, in gospel ministry? That the blessings we've received, they dare not just be for us and for caring for one another and loving one another. That's very important. But also for the broader church of Jesus Christ across our region. What might that look like? What might it look like if we consider that it's not good for us to be a good, strong, healthy church if other churches around us are weak? But if God is giving us health and encouragement and strength, what might that look like for us to be a blessing to other churches? Not just among us here to share those blessings, but for those blessings to spill over and out. You see, during this season, during lockdown, I've heard lots of wonderful things about meals being cooked and baking being dropped off and text messages being sent and phone calls, and just considering how do we support one another. And in this, we demonstrate that we are devoted to one another, and we're growing in this devotion to one another. And as we're devoted to one another, that ought to spill out to other believers around us and other churches, and ultimately that it be shared with the world. That it doesn't just end with us, that the blessings of God that we receive, that they're undeserved in its kindness, that they don't just end with us, that we've received something so that we could give it away and give it away and give it away. So this is what it means to be devoted one to another, not just in a local assembly, but as Christians, like-minded Christians, growing in the goodness of the gospel. But Paul doesn't end there. He doesn't just want to display this being devoted to one another, but there's a way that he wants us to show that we're devoted to one another, and that's the second thing that we see in verse 14, is that we be devoted to good deeds. The way that we demonstrate that we're devoted to one another is by this practical care. It's worked out through our deeds. But notice that when Paul talks about being devoted to good deeds, there's one little word there before that phrase that we dare not miss. He says, let us learn. Let us learn how to be devoted. There is, in other words, there is not this natural ability just to think, this is how I'm going to do good. The way that I want to do good is how I like to receive goodness. I want to do good in terms of what I enjoy doing. And so there's often a selfish aspect about doing good, that we like to do the good that we like to receive. But Paul says here that we ought to learn to do good. In other words, the people that need to receive goodness and receive kindness and to receive help, we need to study them and learn them and know what is it that will help them and encourage them and strengthen them and support them. Not what would I like to do because I'm good at it, but what will help my brother? What will help my sister? How is it other-oriented then? And if it's other-oriented, it's learning. I'm learning how to apply the goodness that they need to be strengthened in faith and hope and in love. So that means that I have to know what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths, how can I come alongside of them and support them? I've got to study them. What this letter has been all about has been this theme of good deeds. Throughout the letter, in fact, Paul has mentioned it over and over and over. In chapter 1, verse 16, he talked about how the false teachers, they can't do any good because they're self-motivated. It's destructive. And what they're wanting is their own self-glory. But then he goes on in chapter 2, verse 7, and he'll say, to be a model. You see that in chapter 2, verse 7? I want you to be a model of good deeds. In other words, you ought to demonstrate that you've been learning how to grow in good deeds and that you know how to good deeds. Then in verse 14 of that same chapter, he says, I want you to be zealous for good deeds. Like this ought to be waking you up in the night and driving your passion in the morning. How can I do good today? Not how can I be argumentative, not how can I win a battle, not how can I prove my point, but how can I do good? And I want to be passionate about doing good. But then in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, I want you to be ready. In other words, that opportunities will come up, and they may come up unexpectedly. So are you ready to do those good deeds? Yes, you're passionate for it, you're zealous for good deeds, but are you ready? And then in chapter 3, verses 8 and 14, he talks about being devoted to good deeds. And then in verse 14, he specifically says that we have to learn to be devoted to good deeds. And so throughout this letter, there has been this pattern and this development of this whole doctrine of doing good to others. And the reason why we want to do good, Paul makes it clear in chapter 2, verse 10, so that we adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. In other words, we display that the self-giving God who's given his own Son for us, that in giving himself for us, He has freed us from the sins of selfishness and pride and envy and jealousy and hatred and anger. And instead, we become self-giving people just as our self-giving God is. That the God who gave his own Son so that we could be freed from sin and death now frees us from the tyranny of self so that we can give and give and give. And so this is especially seen, Paul says, in caring for others. Notice what he says. Let our people learn to devote themselves to good works so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful. There is a need for us in the Christian life to do good, to be fruitful in doing good. That by doing good to others, it is an act of not only fruitfulness for them, but also for us. That we learn how we can serve another person more effectively. That we can learn how to love them better. That we can grow in doing good and doing good and doing good. What would happen if we made it our aim? Dads, husbands, when we drive home from work, we take a couple of minutes to switch work off and turn on our thoughts about how to engage our wives and kids, about how to love them. What might that look like? Moms, you already give so much to your kids, but what might it look like, as Paul says in chapter 2, where we learn to love husbands and children, and we think about how to bless them? Kids, you're going back to school, some of you are teens. Here's my challenge for you. Could you wake up on that first week of school, and could you think, I know it's going to be tough for me, and it's going to be tough for my classmates. I wonder how I could encourage my teacher. What could I say to them that would encourage them? And how can I make my classroom a better place? Or maybe you're an employer. Maybe you can ask the question, what could make this workplace a great place to work? Or you're an employee. How could I make those that I work with enjoy the work? And how could I enhance my work and go above and beyond what I've been asked to do? What if I woke up every day zealous, ready, eager, devoted to do good? We live in a world where people are ready to argue, where they're ready to divide, where they're ready to fight, where they don't see the need in front of their own face because they're so consumed with their own needs. But what if, because we have received so much from a gracious God, we were zealous, ready, eager models to do good? What kind of impact would that have? But it's not just what if I did that, what if you did that, but what if we as a church became known for doing that? What if we studied our community and our region? What if we thought, what does our region, our area need? How can we serve them? Not that we're talking about outreach here. We're talking about loving neighbor as we love ourselves. What could we do so that if our church wasn't here, that the community around us would go, wow, we miss them? That they make an impact. They make a difference. It's good that they're here. I'm glad that this church is here. We're not aiming for people to think exactly like us. We're not aiming for them to be brainwashed. What we're aiming for is the sense that Christianity is good for the world. That it makes a difference. That the gospel has a real impact, that it saves us so that we do good, and that by doing good, we adorn, we display, we show the beauty of a self-giving God so that we might be self-giving, and that others might say, it's not satisfying to live for myself, but to live for God. And that as we do this, we adorn, we show the beauty of the good news of the gospel. So we are devoted to one another. We are devoted to doing good deeds, but lest we get the idea that Christianity is a do-gooder religion, we need to remember the final words of this letter, which is the third thing, be dependent upon grace. This letter ends with Paul sending his love and greetings. It's not the so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. He's actually communicating a deep affection and love. He's got this commitment and this passion that the gospel go forward, and he ends where he began. And where did he begin? It didn't begin with our works. It didn't begin with our devotion to one another. It didn't begin with even our devotion to God. This letter began with a reminder of a God who does not lie. A God who is so committed to us in his self-giving nature that it is his devotion to us that this letter began with and now ends with. And in other words, what we're coming back to is it's not about our works or our devotion, but it is about God's work through his Son who is so devoted to us. If we think about, as Paul says, grace to you all at the end of this letter, you see that at the end of verse 15, the very final line? We get the very clear indication that this letter was not just written for Titus. Titus was to read it, but it was to be read publicly. Otherwise, why would Paul end by saying, grace to you all? In other words, it was a letter to be read communally. Titus was to receive it. It was reinforcing what Titus had been doing, setting the church in order, appointing godly men as elders, confronting false teaching, teaching older men to love the younger men and disciple them, and older women to disciple the younger women so they would love their husbands and their children, and that in all things that the gospel would be shown to produce a beautiful life. And as Paul speaks of this, he now comes to the end where he says, this is all by grace. Now, we need to define this word grace. We're at the end of this letter, but Paul has already talked about when the goodness and kindness of God, our Savior, appeared. He saved us not by what we had done, but by his grace. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. And so we need to define what this grace is. We could define it in two ways. That this grace is, one, it is the undeserved blessings of God. It is God showering upon people who don't deserve love, who don't deserve kindness, who don't deserve forgiveness, who don't deserve adoption, who don't deserve all of these good things being given them. And he showers them upon these people. So grace is the giving of God's undeserved blessings, but there's a second part to God's grace that we need to understand. It is also a supernatural empowerment. If what you hear in Christianity is do this, do that, do this, do that, it becomes a list of rules, then you have fundamentally missed what Christianity is about. It is about, I have received from God that which I do not deserve. I have received the gift that removes the penalty of sin, and it's removed the power of sin, and it's provided the empowerment to do good. This is what grace is, undeserved blessings with supernatural power. And in giving us this supernatural power, Paul, as he comes to the end of this letter, he says, grace to you all. And what Paul means there is, may God's undeserved blessings supernaturally empower you to serve others in radically generous ways that shows that Christ's life, his death, his resurrection is beautiful news. It's beautiful news. So what might God be pleased to do if we were ready, eager, zealous, devoted, learning good works? Because we have received so much from God. As Paul can say in Romans 8:32, if God so willingly gave up his own Son for us, how will he not give us all things? All things to empower us and strengthen us to do good. What might it be like if we were a church that we're studying and learning our community, our church family, other churches around us, how we could do good to them? What kind of impact might God be pleased to do through simple, small, faithful acts to show the beauty of the gospel? in that maybe God would be pleased to do abundantly more than what we could ever ask or think.